Hello and welcome to another Magic Duels gameplay. Today we're taking a look at a red-green Landfall aggro deck that is featuring a lot of the new Landfall creatures from A Battle for Zendikar. So let's get started here with our 1-drops, where we have Goblin Glory Chaser, this one not from Battle for Zendikar but still from Origins. So a 1-1 for 1 red with Renown 1, so if he connects with the opponent he gets a +1/+1 counter and becomes Renowned, and in this case he also gains Menace if he's Renowned, so becomes a lot more difficult for the opponent to block the Glory Chaser. So the reason we included Goblin Glory Chaser is simply because we want additional 1-drops in the deck, since otherwise we only have the Scythe Leopard as our 1-drop. So I think Goblin Glory Chaser is one of the better 1-drops we can play in this slot. Of course that means that we need to run a few cheap removal spells to clear a path for the Glory Chaser, but that shouldn't be a problem. So moving on, we have a Scythe Leopard, which is a landfall creature, so 1-1 for single green, and whenever land enters a battlefield under our control he gets +1/+1, so again get +1/+1 multiple times in the same turn if you, for example, play a fetch land or an effect that puts an additional land into play, so can sometimes attack for 3 damage, which is a lot for 1-drop, but most of the time he'll be getting in for 2 damage and then being a 1-1 on defense, so of course there's some risk to that, but still a decent 1-drop for the deck for sure. Moving on, we have a few copies of Fiery Impulse to clear a path for our cheap creatures, so 2 damage to target creature, and with Spell Mastery 3 damage. We have a decent amount of instants and sorceries in the deck, but most of the time it's still gonna do only 2 damage, which is fine for clearing a path for our 1-drops and 2-drops. Then we also have 2 copies of Titan Strength to pump up our creatures, maybe let them win a combat stab that they would otherwise lose, or just to deal those additional points of damage to the opponent by just pumping an unblocked creature or a creature with trample, which we do have a few of in the deck, so that makes Titan Strength a lot better than if we didn't have those trampling creatures. Then we also have 2 copies of Abbot of Keral Keep, just a very solid 2-drop, with the ability here to exile a card from the top of our library, and we get to play it until end of turn. So usually you don't want to play the Abbot on turn 2, since we have a lot of other 2-drops we want to play instead, but if we can play him on the 3rd turn, we want to play him before playing our land, and perhaps we get to exile a land and play that land for free, which is nice, and otherwise a 2-1 prowess with a decent amount of non-creature spells to trigger him makes him a fine 2-drop as well. Then we get to some of our landfall creatures here. 1 copy of Akoum Stonewaker, a 2-1 for 2 mana, and then his landfall ability is pretty unique because when a land enters the battlefield we can pay 2 and a red to make a 3-1 a red elemental creature token with a trample and haste that will leave the battlefield at the end of our turn. So just to get in some burst damage, and well, a 2-1 for 2 mana is still not horrible, but we would not want to play multiple Stonewalkers, since having multiple copies in play doesn't really accomplish that much, and he's also one of the weaker 2-drops in the deck, I think. This brings us to the better 2-drops in the deck, which are Makindi Sliderunner, 2-1 with trample for 2 mana, and of course Landfall gets +1/+1 whenever a land enters a battlefield. So this one, having trample, is the upside, but he is a little weaker on the defensive side here, so makes it easier for the opponent to trade with the Sliderunner, but on the other hand it's better to use our pump spells with the Sliderunner, for example. And our other 2-drop is Snapping Gnarlid, which is just a 2-2 with no special abilities besides a landfall. So those are our 2-drops of choice. Moving on, we have 1 copy of Slab Hammer, which is pretty awesome in this deck, but we don't want to have multiple copies since it's difficult to manage multiple equipment, especially if you're then low on creatures to actually equip. But 1 copy is certainly very nice, since this gives us a way to return a land from the battlefield into our hand, so we can re-trigger the landfall abilities of all our creatures in play every turn, and also gives them a +2/+2 bonus, which is nice. Then we have 1 copy of Twin Bolt to deal with tokens. We have 2 copies of Swell of Growth, which is a pretty nice pump spell in the landfall decks, since a creature will get +2/+2, but we also get to put a land from our hand into play, which is actually kind of a ramp spell in that scenario. But the problem with Swell of Growth is that often by the time you cast it you might not have any lands left in your hand, so I don't want to run the full 4 copies. I think 2 is enough, since that still gives us the chance of maybe having a few lands left in hand. But if we run too many copies, then it's just going to be a +2/+2 pump spell, and at that point we might as well run better pump spells. Then we also have 1 copy of Retreat to Valakut, which is one of the retreat enchantments that give us 2 options whenever a land enters a battlefield. Here we can give a creature +2/+0 until end of turn, or a creature can't block this turn. So 2 very useful modes in an aggressive red-green deck. But again, I don't want to run too many copies of these types of cards, because they're not actual creatures, so if you have too many of these cards in hand, then your hand doesn't really do much. Then we also have 1 copy of Wildsize, just as an additional pump spell that also gives trample and also draws a card, so goes nicely with a card like Goblin Glory Chaser, for example, or with our Snapping Gnarlid that doesn't naturally have trample, but this will be a nice surprise for the opponent. Then 2 copies of Exquisite Firecraft to deal with 4 toughness creatures, or to just go to the opponent's face to finish them off. Always nice to have access to. Then we have 2 copies of Nissa's Pilgrimage, which may seem a little weird in an aggressive deck, since we're not really trying to ramp in the deck, but it just acts as a card that puts an additional land into play, and then still gives us 1 or 2 lands in our hand that we can play the same turn or the following turn. So it just gives us a lot of lands, and in the Landfall deck it's always nice to have a lot of lands, because otherwise your Landfall creatures are pretty weak if you don't get to trigger Landfall every turn. So Nissa's Pilgrimage can do that for us. Then we get to our 4-drop creatures, where we have Akoum Firebird, 4 mana, 3/3 haste, has to attack every turn if able, and then with a landfall, if we have 6 lands and the Firebird is in our graveyard, we can return it to the battlefield, which is pretty neat. So a very, very powerful creature in the deck for sure. And then our last creature is Grove Rumbler. This is the big landfall creature in the deck, so a 3/3 with trample for 4 mana, but whenever landfall triggers he gets +2/+2, so can really get very big if we can trigger landfall multiple times in the same turn, and of course trample means he's a lot harder for the opponent to block, so we'll get in for damage for sure. And then our mana base, 9 mountains, 7 forests, then 2 Cinder Glade, 2 Rootbound Crag, and then probably the best card in the deck, not kidding, is Evolving Wilds, just because it will give us 2 landfall triggers in the same turn just by playing our land, which is awesome, and of course also fixes our mana. So that's the deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which looks excellent. We've got a 1-drop into a 2-drop with Evolving Wilds for lots of landfall triggers. So just have to hope our opponent doesn't have a 2-drop that stops the Glory Chaser, which of course is a lot better if you're on the play. But we do have a Slab Hammer now, which could pump our Glory Chaser should we need it, but I would prefer to play our other creatures first to put some more pressure on the board. But let's see if our opponent has a 2-drop here, or if he's going to play a tap land and pass. Well, Evolutionary Leap means a no blocker for the Glory Chaser, but of course our opponent will get lots of value out of this in the late game, so we just have to try and kill our opponent before it matters. Swell of Growth also interesting here, but of course I'm just going to attack with the Glory Chaser, and now we have to decide if we want to play the Gnarlid or the Sliderunner, and I think I'll just go with the Gnarlid here. No particular reason other than our opponent could more easily have a creature with 1 power, in which case the Sliderunner is more likely to trade perhaps. And also because we have 2 Gnarlids, so it's kind of difficult to really know for sure which one is the correct creature to lead with. Flashback Marauder, alright, so I think we sacrifice our Gnarlid here. Even though he will get more damage in next turn. This is actually interesting. Yeah, maybe we do go with the Glory Chaser, since the Gnarlid will for sure deal 3 damage next turn, even 4, while the Glory Chaser might get stopped by a bunch of tokens in the future. So let's play our land, Gonna get a Moutain for the Firecraft here. So the Gnarlid will get in for 4, and then we can play another Gnarlid or a Sliderunner, not sure which one. There's definitely also the argument of not using the Evolving Wilds yet and waiting until we have more landfall creatures in play, but I think if we draw a land next turn we want to play 2 2-drops, in which case having fetched with the Evolving Wilds is a lot better. So now if we do draw a land we can play 2 spells in the same turn. Reclamation Sage just as a 2-1 is fine. So would have been bad if we played the Slab Hammer earlier. So looks like our opponent is on just the green-black value evolutionary leap deck. So here it's interesting since we don't have a land. What do we want to do? We could attack and then Swell of Growth whatever our opponent blocks. We could also Firecraft a Sage, but that seems a little loose. So I think we'll just attack and Swell of Growth. Alright, our opponent does not block, which I'm fine with. They probably play around a pump spell. So I think, let's see, we could play the Slab Hammer. I actually don't hate that. Our opponent is not super likely to have a second Reclamation Sage, and by playing the Slab Hammer now, next turn we can equip, attack, and then have a second land, so we can still play a 2-drop in the same turn. Gravedigger, getting back Flashback Marauder here. Still would be nice to draw a land here, because we only get the land back once we attack. Alright, sweet. So this is gonna be a pretty powerful turn. So we can play a land, pump both creatures. Then the question is, do we want to play out our Grove Rumbler? Or do we want to play Sliderunner plus perhaps Swell of Growth or Sliderunner plus Equip? I don't hate Sliderunner plus Equip, since that gives us a land in hand for next turn to re-trigger our Gnarlids, which otherwise would trade with these creatures. So I'm going to equip, leaving up green mana in case we need to use our pump spell. So let's equip, move to combat, attack with both, and return a tapped Mountain. And we can even use the Swell of Growth here plus the land we have in hand for lots of damage. So our opponent double blocking the 3-powered Gnarlid, so if we use our Swell of Growth here, 7-8, we could deal lots of damage and then these trade, or we can save the Gnarlid. This is interesting. Could also just replay the Sliderunner, which also seems fine, since these trade, but we know our opponent has a Flashback in hand. Yeah, let's just let this happen, I think. Play the Sliderunner, which we will sacrifice to the Flashback Marauder and pass the turn. Using the Swell of Growth is better if we fear that our opponent can kill multiple creatures, but yeah, it looks like they're going to use a leap in response to the Flashback, so they can find another creature, find another Flashback, but we're just going to get to kill our opponent on our following turn here, so we don't really care. So we can play a land and then just Firecraft away. No need to do anything too fancy. And our opponent does not have a fog, so he is indeed dead. Alright, sweet. On to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opener. which is a little creature light with only one Scythe Leopard here. But I think we can try and keep this. We do have a lot of creatures in the deck and we are on the draw. And turn 1 Scythe Leopard is pretty powerful, plus we have ways to protect him. Drawing a land, not great there. And of course, if our opponent removes the Scythe Leopard, we don't do anything. But looks like our opponent is stuck on 1 land, which of course helps. Alright, we drew an Abbot, which is nice. We could just play him here since we have lots of lands and we're not that likely to hit a 1-drop that we can play right away. So I think just playing the Abbot here is fine. Also because we have 2 non-creature spells that we can use to trigger prowess. Our other option was using Titan Strength here, just to use a Scry to dig for a creature. But I think playing the Abbot is good enough here. Next turn we could play Evolving Wilds to maybe double trigger the Landfall. And we exiled a Firecraft, which is unfortunate, but we weren't going to be able to cast that. Had we exiled it next turn, of course we would have drawn the Firecraft in that case. Gatecreeper Vine is going to be a blocker. So our opponent did find a second land, finds a Mountain, so could have a sweeper next turn. Which might be a reason to hold up a pump spell to perhaps save a creature from a sweeper. I don't hate using Fiery Impulse to clear a blocker here. And then maybe try to maximize our damage this turn. But then we don't leave up a pump spell to maybe save our creatures from a damage-based sweeper. I don't think we can get too fancy here, playing around too many things, since it's not like our hand is great. So I think we just go with the high risk, high reward play here. So Fiery Impulse, and then we can Swell of Growth, putting Evolving Wilds into play. Or we could even put the Mountain into play if we want to. Might even be better here. So we can also Titan Strength. So we get to deal lots of damage here. Trigger Prowess once again, Scry, and we still have the Evolving Wilds left. And Grove Rumbler is the perfect draw here. So we get to deal 13, which is a lot. And next turn we'll draw Grove Rumbler. So we know our opponent has a Mountain here. Yep, our opponent does indeed have the sweeper, Radiant Flames. But if this Grove Rumbler survives, then we're in business. And now there's also the decision of wanting to play Evolving Wilds or not, and I think we do actually play the Evolving Wilds here. By playing the Evolving Wilds here, we have an instant speed way of pumping the Grove Rumbler in response to a possible damage-based removal spell from the opponent. So we do miss out on perhaps 1 landfall trigger if we don't draw land next turn. But our opponent is at 5, so just pumping the Grove Rumbler once is enough if our opponent doesn't do anything. And Gatecreeper Vine, alright. We got maybe a little punished here by playing the Evolving Wilds, but I still believe it's correct. So our opponent 2 mana up could have some number of removal spells, but not too many. So I think I just attack with the Grove Rumbler here, not using the Evolving Wilds quite yet, since it's not lethal, and again I want to leave it up to protect the Grove Rumbler. Play the Glory Chaser and pass. So again our opponent has to find an answer, otherwise he's just dead on board. Vile Aggregate is not a bad one. So 1-5 right now. So he's gonna have to chump our Grove Rumbler, but the Firebird means our opponent is very likely just dead here, since we can attack for lethal, so unless our opponent has an interactive card for 1 mana here, which would be a Fog, our opponent is just dead. Alright, sweet. A very explosive game. We did get lucky that our opponent didn't remove our Grove Rumbler, otherwise we would have been in trouble. But yeah, sweet. On to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which is a little awkward here since we don't have the Mountain for turn 1 Glory Chaser. But we do have Sliderunner plus Gnarlid. Given that we're on the draw, I think we can try another hand. Well, this one only has 1 creature. Alright, I guess we'll settle for this one. So the problem with the first hand is that we're on the draw and we don't have a 1-drop on turn 1, so we're pretty slow out of the gate. Here, of course, we have the problem that we don't have green. So we'll have to use our first turn to grab a forest. And we also only have 1 creature here, which could be a problem. But we have ways to protect it with Wildsize or to clear a path with Twin Bolt. So definitely not the ideal start. But at least we can interact with our opponent with Twin Bolt here. And we have plenty of lands to keep triggering Landfall, thanks to Pilgrimage also. No play from our opponent, which is interesting. So they definitely could have a counterspell up. Akoum Stonewaker is an interesting draw here. So we could play it over the Scythe Leopard. I think we do play the Stonewalker here, since next turn we could also just play Scythe Leopard plus Twin Bolt, which could also be good. So our opponent didn't do anything with 2 untapped mana there. And now Reef Soul is gonna kill our Stonewalker. Double Scythe Leopard is also a little awkward here. So yeah, let's just play 1. And I think we do just play a land to keep up Twin Bolt and pause a turn. Next turn we can Nissa's Pilgrimage plus play Scythe Leopard. So we're definitely off to a slow start here. Our opponent with the removal spell also. Now Evolving Wilds. Let's see what it gets. Gets a Swamp into Sphinx's Tutelage. Alright, so we know what we're up against now. So we just have to erase our opponent before our opponent mills us out. But that also means our opponent is likely to have many removal spells and fog effect. So here, let's go with the Pilgrimage. Make our Scythe Leopard into a 3/3. And play our other Scythe Leopard. And hope we don't get Languished, which is a possibility here, but we can't really play around it. So opponent down to 17, and next turn we can double pump both Scythe Leopards again, plus play Wildsize if we want to. We get milled, losing some cards and some lands. Opponent plays Visionary, alright. We can kill that with Twin Bolt. Opponent mills us again. More land. And leaves up double black and single green, which could mean fog, could mean an instant like perhaps complete disregard. But here, let's play a land first. Let's see, do we have Spell Mastery? Yes, we do. I think I played a land first here so we can keep up Wildsize in response to a possible removal spell from our opponent. Play the Pilgrimage here. Get 3 lands, which are the last forests left in the deck. Which means our next Pilgrimage will be dead, unfortunately, if we draw it. And then I think I attack with both. Alright, our opponent has a fog. so I'm not gonna waste anything else here. But our opponent is using the fog pretty early here, so that means he might not have any fogs left when it might be more relevant. And the plan here is to Twin Bolt at the Visionary end of turn. Perhaps our opponent plays a second Visionary we can also get with the Twin Bolt. And our opponent just gonna activate the Tutelage's ability here to draw and discard. So maybe our opponent doesn't have any relevant cards left in hand. But that means he's now tapped out. And now we're gonna Twin Bolt the Visionary and our opponent. Let's take a look here. Alright, I'm glad to see Fiery Impulse and actually also the Firebird, which we might be able to get back this turn. Which I think is a plan here. So thank you, opponent. And keep up, I think we keep up red mana, although it doesn't really matter here. And we can attack for 7. Play the Slab Hammer and pass the turn. And this means that even a sweeper is not gonna be the end of the world next turn, since we can just replay the land to get the Phoenix back. Tutelage will happen. Mill an Evolving Wilds and a Gnarlid. Alright, Nissa is not bad here. Our opponent will get to transform Nissa. And I'm guessing our opponent is gonna make a 4/4. Unless he has some sort of fog in hand. Nope, our opponent is plussing Nissa. Finds a land. So yeah, I'm guessing our opponent has some sort of fog effect in hand. But we can just equip the hammer here, which will give us plenty of landfall triggers in the future. And we could play the land here, but if we can hit for 5, then we can just Firecraft our opponent out. So let's attack our opponent with everyone. Trigger the hammer, return a forest. And alright, looks like this worked. And now even if our opponent has a counterspell, the spell mastery will mean the Firecraft is uncounterable. So that's 4 damage to the opponent and can't counter this one. Alright, sweet. On to the next one. Okay, let's take a look here at mulligan. And this one is not great since we don't have any early creatures. So I think we have to mulligan this one as well. Alright, I'll keep this one. We have a turn 1 Scythe Leopard, which is our only creature, so if this one dies, we are in trouble. Firebird is nice, although we can't currently cast it. Swell of Growth will be nice next turn, since we can play Forest. Swell of Growth, the Evolving Wilds in play, grab a Mountain. And that will be a lot of damage. And no blocker from the opponent is nice. Alright, Mountain is even better. So now we get to play the Mountain, pump the Scythe Leopard, go to combat, attack, Swell of Growth, the Evolving Wilds into play, which will grab a Mountain, trigger a Landfall 2 more times, and next turn we get to play the Firebird. So our opponent takes a healthy amount of damage here on turn 2. Down to 14, and next turn we get to attack for another 5 points of damage. We also still have the Titan Strength, which is nice on the Firebird. And our opponent still hasn't played a spell. Alright, Cinder Glade. Play Firebird. Hit for 5. Opponent down to 9. Next turn we have another Landfall trigger in hand, plus Titan Strength. So our opponent will be taking 8 and is currently at 9. So we're not in a bad spot here. And yep, looks like our opponent's had enough. Fourth land, do we see the Acid Moss? Nope, no play from the opponent, so I'm not sure what kind of hand they kept. So here we can play the land to trigger Landfall, get in for 5 plus Titan Strength 8. Could also play the Grove Rumbler, keep the land in hand. But I think if we put our opponent down to 1 here, plus play the Grove Rumbler, we're still in fine shape. So we have to play the Titan Strength first. Sliderunner, I don't think we need. Play the land and attack. Opponent down to 1. And I think it's okay to play the Rumbler, since even if our opponent somehow clears the board, we will still be able to get back the Firebird if we hit a land drop. It's a tapped Gruul Guildgate, so our opponent perhaps stuck on color and didn't have any green cards to play. But we're just going to attack here. And, well, that's gonna get it done. So a hand with only a turn 1 Scythe Leopard turned into a pretty great hand, thanks to the Swell of Growth ramping us and getting out the Firebird a turn early. Alright, on to the next one. Alright, let's take a look here. We've got Glory Chaser, but no 2-drops. We are on the play, but I think having the 2 4-drops here is just a tad too slow. Alright, I'll keep a hand with double Glory Chaser, plus Fiery Impulse to clear a path. So any second land we draw here will be pretty awesome, as it will unlock multiple cards. And if not, we still get to play a second Glory Chaser. Trigger Renown. And if our opponent just plays a blocker next turn, we can still clear it with the Impulse. And it's gonna be hard for our opponent to beat 2 Glory Chasers, but our opponent already has an answer to the first one with Reef Soul. So now we have to hope we draw a land, and we do, perfect. So let's get in there with our Glory Chaser, and now we have to decide which of the creatures we want to deploy. And I think we go with one of the 2-drops here, and I think we go with the Sliderunner, since we're unlikely to want to use the ability next turn, since we want to play the Scythe Leopard. So if we do draw land, I would rather get the additional power. Complete Disregard is gonna take care of the Glory Chaser and not the Sliderunner. Okay, so our opponent with lots of cheap removal here. So our opponent definitely came prepared. We don't find a land, so we just have to attack for 2. And now we have to decide if we want to play the Stonewalker or the Scythe Leopard. Also leaving up Impulse, and I think we do go with the Stonewalker here, since it's a little more mana efficient. Next turn we could still Scythe Leopard plus Impulse if our opponent plays a blocker. Looks like a no play from the opponent and also no land, while we drew Cinder Glade, which is perfect. So let's go ahead and play the Cinder Glade, and I think we could just pay here, since our other option is playing Scythe Leopard, but getting in 3 damage seems fine here. If we could play Scythe Leopard plus another 2-drop, I think I would not use the ability, but given that the alternative to 3 points of damage is just playing the Scythe Leopard with no land in hand, I think getting the 3 damage in seems valuable. Opponent finds a Reef Soul, which he must have top decked to kill our Stonewalker, but our opponent is at 8. And we drew another land, so we get to play the land, pump the Sliderunner, and this is 4 points of damage in hand, so our opponent will essentially be at 1. And I do think we go for the Swell of Growth here. Now that our opponent can't kill our Sliderunner in response. And we also still have a Fiery Impulse that can perhaps clear a blocker. So if our opponent goes land into a Languish, we might be in trouble. But if our opponent just plays a creature, like Erebos' Titan, then our opponent is dead. Because we just get to attack and then Twin Bolt. And the land makes it even easier. Go to combat. And we could just Twin Bolt the Titan plus Impulse it to kill it. I guess we might as well do that. 2 points here. And now the Impulse has Spell Mastery. And that will deal 3 damage. And our creatures are unscathed and get in for 5 points. And their opponent is dead. Alright, sweet, on to the next one. Alright, let's take a look here at our opener, which is a little slow, although we could just go Glade turn 1 into Crag turn 2, play Sliderunner, and then we have 2 Evolving Wilds, which aren't bad, so I think I'll keep. Since Evolving Wilds is pretty great in this deck if you have creatures in play. Not really a land you like to use on the first turn, since it is very valuable later. Another Sliderunner is nice, since we get to play that next turn together with Evolving Wilds. Opponent on Forests. Into Forests and no turn to play. Oh, never mind. Elvish Visionary. It's gonna draw our opponent a card. But of course, Evolving Wilds means we don't really care, since we get to trample over it. And now the question is, do we play the other Sliderunner or the Gnarlid? And I think we can just play the other Sliderunner here in case our opponent has another Visionary. Grab a Moutain. We could have also kept the Evolving Wilds in play to maybe use it next turn, but we still have a second Evolving Wild, so I think getting in the safe points of damage is fine. Now if our opponent goes Mountain into Twin Bolt, of course we're punished. But looks like a Swamp is a play. And Jagscar Archers means their opponent is on some sort of green-black elf deck. So we want to try and kill our opponent before they take over the board with lots of elf tokens. Alright, let's play a land. And now maybe our opponent trades with the Archers. Although, typically the Archers is not a creature the elf deck wants to trade with. Right, they're just going to take it, in which case I think I do pump for the 2 extra points. Get a Forest, and now we have to see, do we want to play the Titan Strength? I think we do. And then we follow it up with Gnarlid, since the Goblin Glory Chaser is not really gonna get in there. And Exquisite Firecraft is a perfect draw. Now that we're gonna get our opponent low, it's just going to finish them off. It does mean that we don't have a land for next turn, but if any of these creatures get in for a point of damage, our opponent is just dead. Alright, Thornbow Archer is gonna pump the Jagscar Archer one more, and now, well, our opponent does have lots of blockers. It's also gonna drain us for 4. So we drop to 16. So let's see what happens if we... Alright, if our opponent gets a little frisky here, then that definitely helps us. So I think we just attack with everyone. The best blocks our opponent can make is one here, one here. Well, the best blocks to not die to Firecraft is block here on the Gnarlid and then absorb all the trample damage, but I don't think our opponent is gonna make those blocks necessarily. So I think we just attack, since even if our opponent makes those ideal blocks, our opponent loses all 3 creatures and we play Grove Rumbler. But if we get in for 1 point of trample damage, we just win. And our opponent takes it, and now Firecraft is gonna seal the deal. Alright, sweet. I wanna thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this gameplay. And as always, have a nice day.